Hello everyone, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, James W. Jesso. Today's podcast features Jungian psychoanalyst James Hollis. He is the author of Living an Examined Life, which I just finished reading and is quite excellent, as well as the author of numerous other books, including Under Saturn's Shadow, which was the book that I read that sort of impulsed me to reach out to him, the larger context of why I felt having James Hollis on the show to talk is contained in the first few minutes of the actual interview. James Hollis PhD was born in Springfield, Illinois, and graduated from Manchester University in 1962 and Drew University in 1967. He taught humanities 26 years in various colleges and universities before retraining as a Jungian analyst at the Jung Institute of Zurich, Switzerland. He is presently a licensed Jungian analyst in private practice in Washington, D.C. He served as executive director of the Jung Educational Center in Houston, Texas for many years and is now the executive director of the Jung Society of Washington. He is a retired senior training analyst for the Inter-Regional Society of Jungian Analysts, was first director of training at the Philadelphia Jung Institute, and is vice president emeritus of the Philemon Foundation. Additionally, he is a professor of Jungian Studies for Saybrook University of San Francisco, Houston. He has written a total of 15 books, including the one I just mentioned, Living an Examined Life, and Under Saturn's Shadow, the other one that I just mentioned. He has also written over 50 articles. His books have been translated into Swedish, Russian, German, Spanish, French, Hungarian, Portuguese, Turkish, Italian, Korean, Finnish, Romanian, Bulgarian, Farsi, Japanese, Greek, Chinese, and Czech. He is a very well-established thinker on the topics of the mind. So, who better to have here on the show to talk about the psychological wounding of men and the psychological wounding of people in general due to the context and constructs of present society. The interview begins momentarily, but before it does, I just want to thank my patrons on Patreon, in particular the people whose names are in the upper corner of this video on YouTube or written in the description to this episode. Thank you very much for your generosity. If you would like to become a patron of the show, you can do so by heading to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. I would really appreciate it because this is my full-time gig and it feels pretty damn good to dedicate myself to increasing the psychedelic literacy of the modern Western world, as well as hopefully bettering the lives of people who enjoy my content and to get paid doing it. That's really actually super excellent. In fact, taking a page out of James Hollis's work, chapter 18 says, honor the difference between job, duty, and calling. And a job is what you do to basically pay the bills, and a duty is your commitment to your responsibilities, the people in your life, maybe you're a father, etc., or whatever it is that is part of your duty. And your calling is what your soul, calls you to do. It's the thing that is like the most unique, beautiful, magical, divine thing that we bring into the world. And each one of us has a calling, and each one of us, the world is a lesser place if we do not come into our calling and live it. And those three things don't always line up. And currently, what I'm doing here with this podcast, it really aligns those three things together. And it feels really damn good to know that that is the case. And my patrons on Patreon are a part of the reason why those three things have come together for me. And so thank you. And thank you in advance for those listeners who have chosen or will choose to become patrons. You could also leave a donation on PayPal or through some form of cryptocurrency. Links to that and to Patreon are contained in the description to this episode. Thank you. All right, that's it. Please enjoy this interview with James Hollis on Adventures Through the Mind. Great. So as I mentioned to you in the email, I do understand that you have a new book, or your most recent book is called Living an Examined Life. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And when did it come out?
Came out February 1st of this year.
Okay. Interesting that I've got you in time to, for your new book, but I got inspired from reading one of your books from like the late 90s, I think, which was Under Saturn's Shadow. So I want to focus specifically on men's issues today because in the community that I live in, there's like this strong smash the patriarchy vibe, which, I mean, understandably so. It's not exactly going well for a lot of people, but in that there seems to be this, and pardon me if I'm using this language wrong, this unconscious hatred of men and like a deep shaming, that the way to smash the patriarchy is to shame and guilt men for their participation in it, which often comes with this sort of let's get our power back by disempowering the people with power. It's like wrapped up in this power complex, and there isn't a lot of like, how can we make sure that everyone becomes empowered in all of this, right? Because I loved your bit about the patriarchy sort of being the external, like a large social infrastructure that is ultimately some big compensation for profound insecurity inside of men. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, the way that I've often put this to women's groups when I've been asked to speak to women's groups is if you're going to understand those strange creatures you sometimes have to relate to called men, imagine these three things. First of all, that your close friends, the intimate persons with whom you share news of your family, problems with your partner, issues that are of great concern to you, you take those people out of your life forever. You can never see them again, and you can't talk about that again. Secondly, imagine that your guiding source, call it your intuition or your instinct or whatever you want to call it, your linkage to that is severed also forever. And thirdly, imagine that your worth as a human being is primarily going to be defined by strangers in terms of your capacity to meet abstract standards of productivity as defined by those strangers. If you can imagine those three things as being your operative daily psychology, then you realize, first of all, you would be profoundly isolated, anxious, under pressure, angry with no place to put it, and pretty much adrift. And when women reflect upon that, they find that appalling. And I said, we're describing the conditioning of most males in our culture. And you're correct in suggesting that you don't oppose one oppressive force by getting another oppressive force. You have to do it by changing in some way the nature of the consciousness out of which people are oppressive or being oppressed, as the case may be. And I think I could give you another anecdotal story here that leads right into our conversation. That book, Under Saturn's Shadow, only came about because I was drafted into it by Philadelphia Jung Society many, many years ago. It was back in the early 90s. And they'd had a lot of programs on women and so forth, and rightly so. And so a colleague invited my friend, Guy Corneau, who had written a book from Montreal on fathers and sons. And they'd never had a program on men before, interestingly enough. And they said, well, would you do an introduction in terms of what are male issues? So I sort of got drafted into it. And uncharacteristically, I dallied, I postponed, I procrastinated. I usually am the kind of person that wants to get something organized so that I don't have to worry about it at the last minute and then throw it together. And I came down to the last weekend before the presentation was due. And I had to ask myself, why is it you're not ready? Then I thought, well, in my profession, because I'm, after all, a practicing analyst, that's called resistance. And resistance is in direct proportion to the experience of anxiety. So what's the anxiety here? I had to, in other words, begin to analyze my own resistance. And so to speak, a voice came up in me and said, but we don't talk about these things. And I thought, well, that's interesting. First of all, where'd that voice come from? Mm-hmm. Secondly, why don't we talk about, well, they're secrets. And you say this and it exposes you, makes you vulnerable, whatever. And I began to realize, oh, well, that's really my point of entry. My own resistance shows the degree to which I, too, as a human being who happened to be born a male, grew up conditioned in a culture of great ancestry, a culture in which men become essentially estranged from their own truth. And so what started to sort of spin out of me was what those secrets were that we were sitting on. And I realized that my moral and psychological duty was to tell secrets. And I had to start by telling them as I experienced them. And if that spoke to other men, that's certainly a bonus. And the first secret was, obviously, that men's lives are as much governed by role expectations as women's lives have been. And just as women have been constricted through the millennia, so have men.
Mm-hmm.
And then that led to the second one, was that men are enlisted from childhood on in a de facto conspiracy to hide that secret, that you're not supposed to in some way talk about these matters. So it stays conspiratorial. It stays in some way in the general unconsciousness of men. And then thirdly, and this is what really began to open the door, as I reflected on it, I thought, women's lives have often been oppressed and often have suffered horrible abuse from men and male-dominated institutions. We know that. And men have been too. And we have to recognize the power of fear that drives those kinds of motives and those institutions. And the deepest, darkest secret that no man will ever truly deny if he's being honest, but also does not want to talk about, is the degree to which his life is being run by fear. In fact, you can say that of both sexes, but particularly for men, the part of the conspiracy is, and you're not supposed to talk about it, if you reveal it, and that's happened to all of us as children, you will be shamed. You will be exiled at worst. You will be in some way laughed at. People will make fun of you, because that happened to all of us. And for all of us, at some point, when we began to operate out of our true emotional base, we found that it was costly. So we learned quickly, don't go there. You stay away from that. And then you start adopting a persona. And one of the ways that children do it, as we know, is get involved in bullying. One of the ways to conceal your own anxieties and your own insecurities is try to find someone you can pick on. And if you can pick on that person, why, it shows you're really sort of the lord and master of your own life, or at least of your playground. And as we know, bullying is very endemic to how boys grow up, and maybe to girls as well, but certainly as boys grow up. And it's always a confession, unwittingly, of one's own insecurity, that I have to feel that I need to put down some other child in order to be able to feel good about myself.
Well, I mean, right away, just the insight that domination behavior and power complex behavior emerges from a place of profound fear and insecurity, and the fear and insecurity of manyfold, but say particularly being shamed or being shamed for not being a man. It makes it very obvious right away that probably the worst approach is to then continue to use guilt and shame to modify men's behaviors. And I want to get into what sort of where this insecurity comes from. In particular, in specific to the relationship between the son and the mother and the father. But before we do that, maybe you can give us a little bit of a foundation in exactly what Jungian psychoanalysis is, because I think understanding that will give a greater sense of comprehension when we start getting into talking about the archetypal father and the archetypal mother.
Sure. Well, first of all, Jungian psychology is derived from Carl Gustav Jung, who was born in the 19th century, 1875, passed away in 1961, was one of the creators of modern psychodynamic psychology. And psychodynamic psychology is an approach to trying to address the whole person and seeks to engage in a conversation with the unconscious, because much of what we do really comes from the unconscious. And we may rationalize it later or try to legitimize it, justify it, but it's really come from a deeper place within us. And also to recognize that underneath all of this is the recognition that, you know, who I am and what I'm avoiding or what I'm not dealing with keeps spilling into the world through me. So we have to take the visible world to try to work backwards into the visible world. You know, much psychology is addressing our behaviors, and appropriately. Much of it's talking about our cognitive processes, and appropriately. And sometimes people take a biological or medical approach to these issues, all of which, if you put them together, still does not sum up the human being. Mm-hmm. There's another dimension there that is not addressed in most psychology sufficiently, in my view. And that is what is essentially the problem of meaning. What does it mean to be a human being, first of all? What does it mean to be a man? What does that mean? And to the degree that my culture defines that for me, then in some way what that means to me inherently gets overridden and neglected and abused. So where does it go? Well, it goes into unconscious behaviors. It goes into bullying. It goes into abuse. It goes into self-defeating behaviors. It goes into self-medication. It shows up as depression. It shows up in 1,000 ways, but it never goes away. It goes somewhere.
So just to clarify, you're talking about like the sense of personal meaning being sort of squashed by dysfunctional cultural dynamics or norms, but it doesn't go away. It sort of starts to leak out in all these destructive compensational behaviors.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Sure. And again, tracking back to the archetypal roots, and by archetypal, we mean in terms of the essential patterns of human experience. In other words, you and I could have a dream tonight that's very unique and personal to us, and yet it uses the same images and processes that were dreamt thousands of years ago. We see tons of evidence of that. We see recurrent patterns in history, as well as in our personal lives. And so when I began to sort of reflect on the sort of origins of all of this, I began to recognize that there was a sense of sort of ancestry of this power complex. That's why I use the phrase under Saturn's shadow. The original gods all saw their children, their sons, as potential rivals. And from the get-go, they were caught up in the power complex. How do I retain control? So sons tried to kill fathers, fathers tried to kill sons, and so forth. And this was playing out in the archetypal field. And so in a certain way, the whole patriarchy has been based upon. In other words, there's a place for male values. There's a place for masculine values. The patriarchy is a structure whereby the power complex expresses itself. And so men have labored under those power issues, been defined by them, crushed by them, or co-opted by them, as the case may be, literally for millennia. So in Jungian psychology, we're constantly working towards what is the healing process looking like in person's psychological life. And rather than try to suppress symptoms, which is what most people would want to do, and understandably, we rather ask the question, where is this coming from in me? What is this given rise to in me? If, for example, I follow the dictates of my culture and I'm driven by success, if I'm climbing the ladder at any cost, including my relationships, including my own body, including my own emotional life that I have to run roughshod over, because everything's based on being a success, climbing the ladder. And then I get there and I find it empty and boring, or I find myself depressed. We have to ask the question, why has the psyche withdrawn its approval and support from where the executive function is putting all of its energies? And of course, the executive function has been co-opted by the ideologies and complexes of the culture, both family of origin and, of course, popular culture. So in some way, we all become inherently neurotic, and I use that in a non-judgmental way, meaning we are split between our instinctual truth and our socialized values. And the more divergent those polarities, the deeper the split within the person, which is one of the reasons why men grow up to be strangers to themselves. They're by and large strangers to each other, but they're strangers to themselves as well.
Mm-hmm. So let's track down where this estrangement from ourselves as men comes from. Which you have a fairly lengthy discussion in Under Saturn's Shadow about the mother complex.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go into sort of maybe couch it in the impact that early life has on the one's sense of self, sense of the world, and behavior as an adult? So sort of like this is the role of early life, and then specifically talk about the role that the mother complex has on the child, the young boy.
Sure. First of all, the mother typically is the most important person we've ever met. We not only arise out of her body and are nurtured by her predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly in childhood, but our first years are dominated by these necessary feminine presences, and thank goodness, or we wouldn't have still be here.
Mm-hmm.
But it, in some way, it makes of them an inordinate sort of influence in our lives, especially as men are away or men are not part of that parenting dyad or are dysfunctional in some way. And the missing father has been a particularly strong motif over the last 100 years or so. And so, whatever that experience is about, whether it's of affirmation, support, reassurance, or some other experience of being invaded by her emotional presence or being insufficiently met and supported by her, that gets internalized as a man's mother complex. And by complex, that's a neutral word. It just means how is your history loaded up? What are the messages? What's the splinter narrative that goes with those kinds of experiences? And that helps define who you are, not only in relationship to her, but progressively to other people in your life, because it's a kind of paradigm for relationship itself, especially with the opposite gender as you meet them along the way. So there's a difference between the personal mother complex and the mother complex that we get from the culture. And so, again, if you think of the mother, what are the general associations? We think of nurturance, warmth, protection, etc., all of which are needful and necessary, and too little of which, or too much of which, creates an imbalance in the psyche of the boy. And one of the things that you'll find so often is when, as so frequently happens, in divorces, the boy, particularly the adolescent boy, is left with his mother, and maybe necessarily so. I'm not judging or criticizing that. What often happens then is, what it is, does it mean to him to become a man? And Robert Bly said once, today many men learn their concept of the masculine, if not from popular culture, from the negative animus of their mother. In other words, the mother's neediness that then can get transferred to her son, or her anger at men for what has happened to her, or 1,000 things. And many men have talked to me about feeling that they were then in charge of being their mother's protector, their mother's confidant, their mother's enabler, as the case may be. And again, created in them a tremendous inner ambivalence of need, necessity, duty, and on the other hand, a feeling of engulfment, and no sense of sort of grounding or reinforcement from any, sort of paternal side of things. Because we also have to remember, too, in our culture, we've seen the erosion and essential disappearance of rites of passage that traditionally accompanied what it meant to be a boy becoming a man. And there were, roughly speaking, 6 stages in that process that occurred at the beginning of puberty, roughly 12, where the first stage is separation. In other words, the boy didn't receive an engraved invitation. How would you like to leave the comfort and protection of the hearth to enter the very difficult world of male survival out there? So he's pulled away, sometimes even violently. Secondly was a ceremony of death, because what's dying is the psychology, naivete, and dependency of childhood. It's a way of saying childhood is over. Thirdly, a ceremony of rebirth, because some emergent being has to come out of that. Fourth is the teachings. And traditionally, there were teachings in three particular categories. What you might call the archetypal field, such as, well, who are our gods? Who is our tribe? To whom do you belong? From whence do we come? What is this life journey is about? What happens after life? Okay. Now, those are teachings necessary to link people to a larger order, to a larger context or reality than one's just personal existence. You're part of a civilization, after all. And notice how that's pretty much missing in our culture. Mm-hmm. Secondly, the teaching of the specific rights, duties, and privilege of civic life. In other words, what's expected of you, of man, in our culture. And, we say basically to boys today, grow up, get a job, and get some computer skills, go out and make money. That's what it's about. Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, the specific tools of learning, such as hunting, fishing, agriculture, warfare, child rearing, whatever the case may be. So all that's missing. And we have no serious rites of passage. And so the youth stays in many ways an undeveloped, unseparated adolescent, even into his 20s, as we know.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes into their 40s even.
Sometimes. I know 70-year-olds who are essentially, unfinished boys at some level. And I don't say that judgmentally. I just say it descriptively of their psychology. And some are in positions of authority. And then the fourth stage typically was, or the fifth stage, I think, that was the stage of the ordeal, some testing. And the critical test of all of the varieties of rites of passage around the civilizations of the world was isolation. You have to learn to find how to cope with your own fear, learn your own resources, learn that you need to be able to reach inside yourself and draw upon something to survive and prevail, and so forth. And then the last stage, the sixth stage, was returning to the culture. Now, admittedly, a simpler culture than ours, less complex. But you can see how those rites of passage that were not, after all, created by central committees somewhere, they were universal. And the reason was our ancestors perceived that in a certain way, the natural indolence that's in the psyche of all of us, we'd all, at some level, like to remain children, stay at home, have somebody take care of things for you, worry about food, worry about the problems of life, and, have a good time. Video games, right? And, and yet for the civilization to be served, they have to have adults. They have to have people show up and take care of the necessary business of survival. And so, again, in our time, you can see how the mother complex on a cultural level has been extended into the society. Very little today helps a boy grow up in a constructive way.
Mm-hmm. And even beyond boys, it's increasingly more present that there needs to be less and less actual challenge, threat of danger or challenge, everything from, and understandably so, like padded playgrounds, and helmets for kids when they're just playing in the park, right? All the way up to like safe spaces. And I'm not necessarily speaking out against safe spaces as opportunities for people who have been traumatized to feel like they can be with their emotions without the fear of dying or the transference that emerges or whatever. But increasingly more so, this expectation, especially on the left end of the political spectrum, that everything has to be like constantly safer, and never really accepting and opening up to the fact that life isn't safe and will never actually really be safe. Life itself is an inherently dangerous, risky thing that being an adult requires being able to walk through that risk and be prepared to take the consequences of it.
No, that's absolutely true. And I'm not in any way suggesting that we can take these ancient rites of passage and try to graft them onto our culture, because these things rose out of the life and experience of specific peoples. And when you take someone else's experience and try to graft it onto yours, it usually doesn't work. And I know men's movements, for example, who've tried to do this with the best of intentions. I'm not critical of them. And they tend to feel arbitrary, a little foolish, a little contrived. And whether they have any lasting significance, I seriously doubt. But what this does mean is to be a man in an adult body today, and knowing that one has not yet gone through some kind of passage, means that one is very much psychologically, maybe spiritually, adrift. And that's one reason why, on the one hand, you have the continuing appeal of the drug culture. You know, when the going gets tough, the tough get stoned kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Because that's the mother complex at work. You know, you fall back into a pain-free kind of clouding of reality.
You're talking more narcotics, which would be like sort of specifically different than, say, drinking ayahuasca or something that confronts you with the pain inside of yourself.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. And, you know, the drug could be food, it could be alcohol, it could be
television.
Yeah, and it can also be video games, you know. And that's one of the chief seductive powers for young males today, adolescents and those into their 20s. There's nothing wrong with a video game. It's, again, what it's used for. Mm-hmm. In other words, I don't have to live a real life because I can, in a sense, fantasize. I can put it up there on the screen. And there's a stage of growth, and historically that's been sort of between 10 and 15, where that's sort of how you begin to image yourself going into the world. You know, that's why boys will put superheroes or sports figures up on their wall or something like that, because they're trying to sort of access some of that kind of energy or potential within themselves. Mm-hmm. The problem is, if you stay in that world, you never live your own journey. Mm-hmm. You do. And then you have the men who, get sucked up into the culture in a way where the whole idea is, you're making money, being a success, climbing the ladder. I mean, we all got co-opted into that, mm-hmm. myself. Yeah. And how many people have I worked with through the years who have done all the right things, men or women, all the things expected of them, and performed to the best of their ability. And there's this deep sense of aching inside, this hollowness, this sense of the sort of meaninglessness of all of that, And in fact, that's what happened to me. And I was privileged to have a good life. And I, my early life was in academia. And I enjoyed the play of ideas, as you might expect. Yeah. And at the same time, I found something completely missing in my life and hadn't begun to deal with how much of myself had been repressed along the way. So I was privileged, and I can say that now, I didn't say it at the time, with a depression at midlife, which is the first time I began to really sort of stop and say, hey, what's going on here? How is it that I cannot feel okay when I have all of this richness around me? Or I've at least accomplished what I wanted to accomplish in my life. And that's a humbling process, very humbling. It means I may have missed out on something profoundly important here. And you can see why, if I try to just sort of medicate that away or try to, finesse it into saying, oh, I'll just get a new relationship or I'll get a better job. And that's what people do, thinking if I can change the outer, it'll change the inner. Mm-hmm. And seldom does that work.
Mm-hmm. And, well, you're still carrying around those same things. Like I think it was Carl Jung that said something along the lines of, what we do not bring into the light of our conscious awareness controls us from the shadows. So if we don't deal with whatever it is that led us into this dysfunctional situation in the first place, then we'll just end up recreating or discovering, co-creating a similar dysfunctional situation repeatedly.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the new book, and I have a chapter in there saying basically it's meaning, not happiness. In other words, we're all told by our culture the whole idea of life is to be happy. Well, what does that mean? Okay? When you're thirsty, a glass of water makes you happy. Too much water, you drown, right? Happiness is very contextual, very transient, and it occurs as a byproduct of you being in right relationship to your own soul at the time. And it's not something that's a fixed state of being. So it's like saying, well, if I can get this job, this promotion, this relationship, or live in that particular house, I will be happy. Okay, we'll try it. The big sort of religion of popular culture, of modern Western world, is materialism.
Mm-hmm.
When you feel empty, you fill it with objects, all right? Mm-hmm. Especially the new electronic seductive tools, such as we're using. And they have a value, of course, but it's sort of saying, all right, now that you've done that, how is that working, right? How is that working? Where do you go from here?
And of course, this applies to much more than men. This applies to everybody wrapped up in sort of the materialist consumer culture that is the heritage that we have been, bequeathed by our accidentally complicit forefathers and foremothers.
Mm-hmm. Sure. In 1864, Emily Dickinson wrote once a strange aphorism. She said, "The sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can." And I think that was her metaphor to say, look, do you understand that you have to find a compass? And do you have a compass? And where is your compass? Because initially our compass is, the directives of the outer world. What mom says, what dad says, what my teachers say, what my culture, what my employer says. Mm-hmm. It's become our compasses, so to speak. And let's say we've done all of those things, as so often happens. Why is it then not feel in some way confirmed by those autonomous processes inside of us that are continuously registering their opinion about things? And so in a sense, the real question is, all right, if in some way by following the instructions from your culture, and let's assume they're well-intended, it takes you to a place that is not confirmed inside of you, then it's clear you're going to have to look in some other direction of your life. And by what lights, by what authority, by what sort of directions do you find a new course? And often people will find themselves in a period of, the dark night of the soul for weeks, months, sometimes years. And yet history is full of people who going through that come out on the other side having a greater clarity about this is what my life journey is about. This is what makes sense to me. And there may be a lot of costs attendant upon that because people may not support that. People may not understand that. And it's not narcissistic, ironically, because narcissism is about the insecurities of the ego and its needs to reinforce itself. Narcissists are profoundly insecure people. Mm-hmm. It's rather about it's humbling. What is my life really called to serve? That's the point. In other words, whether we know it or not, in the first half of life, and I'm speaking half very loosely here, it could be the first 70 years of your life. You're in service to the messages around you by and large. You either accept them and serve them, which is common, or you run from them and get caught in, I'll be anything but that. I won't live my mother's life, or I won't repeat my father's life, or whatever. And I'm still being defined by that, not something in here. Mm-hmm. You're out there trying to, quote, treat it in some way, medicate it, distract it, whatever treatment plan you figure out. You're not absent serving that one way or the other.
So I want to put a pin in this for a second, because this podcast talks fairly extensively about psychedelics, and there's a massive resurgence right now of utilizing psychedelics inside of a psychotherapeutic container for people who feel that they're in this exact same situation that you're talking about. But I want to backtrack for a second and just make sure that for the listener, something is abundantly clear, besides the fact that this is a tremendously complex subject and the hour that we have to speak about it is not even close to scratching the surface. Sure. And that is that in speaking about the mother complex, it might be easy to misunderstand the point of talking about that and think that it's emerging as a blame to the mother for the problems of the father or for the problems of the young boy. But it's actually a lineage of interconnected relationships that span, men and women and people who, identify with other, gender or gender definitions, whatever it might be. It's this massive interconnected complex system that's all feeding into the mother as the primary focal point for the relationship between the child, and then eventually that child's relationship to the rest of the world. Can you correct
no,
that? Or
that's well said. And, and in fact, the issue of the fathers is, how many fathers do we know who've been able in some way to find their own inner compass or find a link to their own depth, their own soul, and live that journey? Because Jung said something I think that properly should haunt all of us who are parents, and that is, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. And I think what he's saying there is, wherever I'm stuck, wherever I'm blocked, wherever I'm governed by fear or lack of personal permission, I'm going to pass that on to my children. And they're either going to be sort of following the message and be stuck similarly, which is common, or be spending their life trying to compensate for that, overcome it, not even knowing that they're living somebody else's agenda, someone else's unfinished business, and not their own. So in a way, another way you can put that is to say, remember, in the rites of passage, the initiatory process was governed not by the personal father, because he too was someone the youth had to leave. He was part of the greater hearth experience. It was rather the wise fathers. So then you have to ask yourself today, well, where are the wise fathers in our culture? Where are the tribal leaders and so forth?
Well, unfortunately, there are people like Donald Trump. There are people like Vladimir Putin. There are people who, I want to say Jordan Peterson as well. I don't actually have much of a problem with him, but he's very much taking on the role of a tribal father for a lot of men right now. But the previous examples of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin as extreme examples, these are the tribal fathers of our culture, and they are broken, insecure, damaged men desperately grasping onto machismo and yielding this dysfunctional heritage of the patriarchy to maintain the only sense of power that they've ever had, which is power over others.
Which is sadly true, because, in a sense, the need for the power is compensatory to the inner sense of emptiness and insecurity. And that's the thing you have to recognize. In other words, what you don't see is what's governing what you see. In other words, as I said about narcissism, and both of those individuals in particular are very narcissistic, it's a profound defense against inner emptiness. The narcissist doesn't look in the mirror and fall in love with himself. He looks in the mirror and doesn't see anybody staring back. That's why he continuously has to have the reassurance of family, children, or the public, and will go to a great extent. And wheresoever the power complex prevails, and in both of them it prevails, you see a compensation for what they cannot face, that inner sense of emptiness and insecurity.
And so, I mean, obviously the patriarchy is an issue that needs to be addressed, and I want to get into what is definitely something that is an issue for all genders, not just for men. But I just want to sort of close up on something here in regards to men, which is that in this situation we need to find these wise fathers, because we're now basically living in a society that's formed around this patriarchy, or the resistance, the smash the patriarchy vibe, which is almost understandably a good progression, but comparatively it's still just your life defined by this thing and is not really freedom at all. And we have these men who aren't men, they're boys, they're stuck in their adolescence, they're stuck in their childhood, they've never really been given good father figures, and they're now being confronted with the idea that with white male privilege and all these things that invite them to feel shame for who they are, which they can't handle because it's already overloaded, and they end up reaching to things to sort of just bolster that machismo, and you get things like men's right activism and people like the sort of the more extreme versions of the alt-right and these types of things. What are we to do as a larger politically active community to help address these issues without perpetuating and participating in the same power complex?
Well, that's a huge question. And again, the secret has to do with, to what degree is your life being governed by your fears? And you mentioned the alt-right for a moment. I mean, it's mostly young males. adolescence and 20s and early 30s, and in most cases, with some exceptions, it sort of burns out by later life. But what that's about is this desperate look or search for a cause, search for something that offers the illusion of power, a restoration of your stature in life when you feel it's under attack in all directions, and most of all, a kind of sense of, here are your verities, here are your truths, and you grasp that, and that's what you need for your compass. And the problem is, of course, all of it in some way is based on dehumanizing those individuals and other people around them, of course. Because again, the problem of power is not a problem. It's a problem when it gets caught in complexes like that, you see. Power is how we use energy to address life's problems. We need power. There's a difference between the power complex and empowerment, for example.
Yeah, totally.
In other words, both genders have the same dual task, boy or girl. Two things: figure out in your life what feeds you, what nurtures your soul, your spirit, okay? Because you need to find that. And secondly, what empowers you? What gives you a sense of your growing capacity to do your life in the world in a way that makes sense to you? And again, if you've been privileged to have affirmations and wise counselors along the way, there's a bridge for you. See, one of the things missing for males in our time, by and large, is mentors. And a mentor is not necessarily wise in every area of life, but the mentor is a person who says, well, here's this brook we have to cross. Here's how we build a bridge across that, I mentioned my friend Guy Corneau a few minutes ago, who did the original book on fathers and sons, and he used to do a lot of workshops with men. And he said, invariably, the part of the workshop that everybody said was the most meaningful part of the entire workshop is where he had an older man and a younger man pair off and go over and be by themselves for a while. And the instruction was to the older man, tell this younger man how to do something. It could be how to build a bird cage, how to repair your car, how to prepare your taxes. I mean, it could be anything that you feel you've learned that's important to you in your life. And he said it was so clear that there was something profoundly moving to the older men to be able to share something with those other young men. But it was profoundly meaningful for those young men to have a sense of loving guidance. Mm-hmm. And it didn't matter what they were teaching. It was, he said, underlining this need for the mentor. How do you get across? How do you bridge? That's why it was the elders of the tribe, not the personal father, who were the mentors. And that's why I said they began by teaching, the sort of larger metaphysical truths of our people. This is why we exist, what we're here for as a civilization. It's like that grounds you in something larger than you. It's not just, your resume. It's like, here's how you're part of history, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And this is, and I understand, I understand like the premise of the gender dichotomy between men and women, and I don't know what your involvement is. I don't know what my own personal involvement and thoughts on this whole matter is, because I haven't thought it through enough so, but it sounds like what you're describing, exists for men, for women, and then it would hopefully eventually, if not already, need to exist for people who might not choose to identify with one of those two particular genders, or somebody who was born a female but feels deeply inside of themselves that they are a man, or vice versa. Like, this is just really good, beautiful present guidance. I mean, of course, we're talking about men right now, but I just want to expand that vision too for anyone else that's listening who says, I'm not a man and I don't want to be.
That's why I said, whatever your understanding of yourself, you have two basic tasks in life. Figure out what feeds your soul and your spirit. And you may have to try a number of things before you come to that which does. Mm-hmm. And secondly, what empowers you? In other words, what are the fears and what are the lack of examples and the things that hold you back and keep you from stepping into your life? And what are the things that support you and give you a sense of the legitimacy of what you're doing? And those are the tasks that all of us have, no matter what our orientations may be. And we live in a time where both men and women, we have to thank women for having challenged so profoundly some of these limiting stereotypes. But it's like underneath all of this, though men feel threatened, they also are potentially being liberated.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the male definitions, as I tried to suggest earlier today, were very, very constrictive. If you have to be a man at the cost of a relationship to your own soul, then you're in real trouble.
Yeah, that's something you wrote about that I love, which was like the primary roles given to men by the social norms are protector and provider, and these two roles, could never do service to the full complexity of a man's soul.
Of course not. Of course not. No. And, men at some level don't even know they have a soul. And I'm using soul, as we're defined as men, that is. We become, among other things, these productive animals. And if you're good at that, you're rewarded. And if you're not good at that, you're shamed in some way. You feel less adequate, less sufficient. And, what do I mean by soul? It's simply a metaphor to talk about, that deepest essence of who you are. That who you are when you were born, and it'll be who you are all the way through. And it has very little to do per se with your socialized roles or your stages of life. It's like something inside of you knows you better than you do. And when you can, from time to time, being in harmony with that, you're filled with energy, you're filled with purpose. The feeling function supports you, and so forth. And the truth is, we all have these internal corrective systems, but we all are conditioned early on to overrule them. Oh, you're not feeling that. You can't say that. You can't do that. I mean, those 1,000 voices. And so we become our own oppressors. We ally ourselves against these internal guidance systems. Just to give an example. The feeling function is not something I choose. I can choose to ignore my feelings, split them off, anesthetize them, project them onto other people. But if what I'm doing is right for the soul, then the feeling support is there. And when I'm doing what's wrong, I can mobilize my energies, and sometimes life demands that we do that. But in time, it leads to that loss of purpose, loss of connection, leads to ennui, boredom.
You mean not having a congruence of your feelings saying yes to what you're doing?
Absolutely. Yeah. And another one is the energy system. If what I'm doing is right for me, the energy's there. Otherwise, I'm just slogging it through, right? The Monday morning blues. I've got to get up and go do that again, you see. As Thoreau said, most men lead lives of quiet desperation. And in most cases, it's quiet. So where does that go? It goes into self-anesthetizing behaviors. It goes into anger. It goes into road rage. It goes into the abuse.
Domestic violence, yeah.
Exactly right. And it all gets referred outward in some way because I can't face it inwardly. Go ahead.
Okay, we have limited time because I want to honor the time that you've gifted to us here today, and I hope that I'm not wasting time with this next question, but it's something that's really meaningful to me, and I don't know what thoughtfulness you have on it, like if you've invested any thoughts around it, and it has to do with the Canadian Jungian analysis Jordan Peterson as sort of presenting himself these days as sort of a father figure. And I've watched radical adoption of his ideas without much consideration by people who often mischaracterize what he's doing into things that might not be the most functional for the dismantling of the patriarchy and moving into a more horizontally mutual empowerment place among all peoples. And I've seen other people also mischaracterize his work and move against him radically, also very unthoughtlessly, with a lot of ideological support behind their criticisms. And I don't really know where he stands. And this question is not to ask you to deconstruct or criticize him, but it's more as a Jungian analyst who is so clearly, well-versed, respected in your field and accomplished. Do you feel like he is accurately representing accurately representing Jungian psychoanalysis and providing good support for boys looking for a father figure?
Well, I can't really answer that question sufficiently. What I would say is when you talk about representing Jung, I would have to ask which Jung are you talking about? Jung who was writing in 1900, the Jung who was writing in 1910, the Jung who was writing in 1920, and so on up the line. There are many, many Jung, so to speak. And those of us who have been in the field for so many years, frankly, continue our discoveries and our understanding of Jungian psychology. And, Jung famously said once, "I'm Jung, thank God, not a Jungian."
Yeah.
And what he was trying to say is, let's not see this as an ideology. It's more about an attitude toward trying to dialogue with your own depths in a way that qualitatively affects your relationship to people all around you. So I think the real question is, I can't evaluate or judge his understanding of Jung and so forth. And I have to take maybe every single idea and sort of look at that,
Right.
which we don't have time for. But I'd rather say, people need to experience Jung themselves directly, which means read, very few people read Jung. And even fewer people understand Jung. And those of us who have been devoting a lot of our energy to that are still working at it after all these years.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Let's move into my last question, which is the one we put a pin in earlier. We see, and of course, we're sort of sliding out of discussion specifically around men, but I welcome any specific men talk that comes out in the answer to this question, which is that we're talking about getting to a point in life where all of a sudden, you're all the way up to the top of the ladder and it's against the wrong wall. There's nothing there. And, we might be privileged with depression, or we might be privileged, as you said, with some sort of illness that calls into question everything that we once believed. Currently, there is a lot of excitement, curiosity, and hopeful potential for the use of psychedelic medicines inside of a psychotherapeutic container, suggesting that it helps people explore their inner worlds and garner some sense of meaningful understanding of themselves in the process. I don't know what level of involvement you have or knowledge you have in this, but from the point of from your position as a particular Jungian psychoanalyst, what do you see as the potentials and possibilities of the use of psychedelics within a, say, Jungian analysis or therapeutic context?
Well, let me say, I have personally never used such drugs. I've never recommended it, and I won't. I've had a couple of clients who have undertaken the plant healers, or the plant teachers as they call them, and to good effect. And all I can say is for some people, and I think for a person who is, in a psychologically shaky place, it's the last thing I would recommend, because they can be so overwhelmed by the data of the unconscious as to lose hold on to, the capacity to integrate that material. Because again, the power of the unconscious is immense. As Jung said, whoever's discovered the power of the unconscious knows from that point on one's not really the master of one's own house. That's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah.
So when you further weaken the ego's capacity to assimilate. Now, let me give an example. Let's say you have a very powerful dream tonight that's very troubling to you, scary, let's say. And you wake up and you say, oh, well, what a terrible dream that was, or wonder what that dream was about. And then you go to work and you function because your ego's reassumed its normal, contact with external reality. But what if you go to work with the dream imagery still living and imposing itself on you? You realize your orientation would begin to, dissolve, and you would have increasing difficulty in orienting yourself to the tasks of daily life, which is sadly what happens when people are, say, schizophrenic, for example. They're really being overwhelmed by the powers of the unconscious. It's not a game, and it's not a toy, and you don't mess with it. The two people that I referred to were mature people who very thoughtfully entered that process. And they felt that it had opened to them, shall we say, rooms in the great mansion that we carry inside that they hadn't visited before. And some of it was scary, and some of it was illuminating. And they both felt that the net effect was positive for them. But on the other hand, I'm not a person who is willing to make the assessment in advance whether this is a good idea for someone or not, because an awful lot depends on something that's very hard to measure, and that is, what is their ego strength and capacity to contain, to hold, and not be carried away. That's one reason why it's not a toy. And I'm sure you weren't saying it was, but
no, certainly not. Certainly not. Yeah, if anyone who's been participating in the larger body of my work here with this podcast and beyond it would definitely see that I approach them with a lot of reverence and some hard-earned lessons of mature use.
Sure,
Sure.
So, in other words, excuse me, I'll give you one other. I might also say there are other ways of accessing the unconscious. One of which is dream work, which I do a good deal of, because again, you have to recognize there's some other intelligence that's inside of each of us that's observing our life and commenting on it, and it would make sense. Jung called that the 2 million-year-old person inside of each of us. And he said, wouldn't it make sense to stop and pay attention and talk to that 2 million-year-old person from time to time? And the same is true from whatever agency is working to produce our symptoms, and often waking us at 3 a.m. with clarity about something, and so forth. So I will say this work is about dialoguing with the unconscious, and medication may or may not help with that. Drugs may or may not help with that. They can get in the way, as we know. They can also facilitate. So, you have to see this on a person-by-person basis.
Excellent. Thank you. As the final question, before I get details on how listeners can get more information about your work, copies of your books, etc., maybe just a summary, or like a quick summary of what you feel might be the most important, actionable, pragmatic piece of advice from this whole interview, or even somewhat unrelated, that you would like to offer to the people who might be struggling with their current situation in relationship to men. So that could be to women, it could be to whoever, but since we all have relationship to men, what might be the most important, actionable piece of pragmatic advice you would offer?
Well, I think whether you're a man or a woman who stands in relationship to a man, and everybody does sooner or later, you have to understand, too, that men, generally speaking, not everyone, but generally speaking, are adrift. They're governed by fear, they're governed by shame, by and large, and the compensatory, treatment plan for that, as we were describing. And that one needs to understand from where that's coming in those persons. The real invitation, I think, for both men and for women is the recovery of personal authority. That's the central project of the entire second half of life. In other words, when we're born, we're tiny and vulnerable, and we're in a world of giants and large presences around us, and we all overlearn the message. The world's big and you're not. The world's powerful and you're not. So we sooner or later have to try to fit in, or at least create narratives or stories that help us avoid or finesse that relationship. And then we become captive to our own stories. And that's part of what psychoanalysis is about, is how we bring to the surface what are the stories you've been observing, whether you know it or not, that's produced these patterns and produced these symptoms. And then work backwards, say, how do I bring those stories to consciousness, and how do I begin to challenge them with maybe a larger story? And the recovery of personal authority means sorting through the enormous traffic that any one of us has at any given moment and saying, now, which of those messages are truly coming from my own depths, from my own soul? And secondly, finding the courage to live that in the world, which is cheap. It's not easy to do that. And thirdly, to do it with some persistence and endurance and perseverance. And that's how you live your way into your truth. And the second half of life, again, speaking very loosely rather than chronologically, is about recovering your life, recovering your sense of your journey. What is my life about? What in me wants expression? What in me wants to be realized in the world? Because our great gift, which is what Jung meant by individuation, is being who you are. That's your contribution to the great mosaic of life. Not narcissism, or it's not self-indulgent. It's actually humbling because it calls you to serve something larger than your ego comfort. And in that, you're rewarded with a sense of meaning and purpose.
Beautiful. Thank you. Where can the listeners find more information about what you're doing and follow the progression of your work?
Well, I have a website, simply jameshollis.net, and all the books are available on Amazon and local bookstores, the usual sort of thing. So I'm not particularly comfortable with self-marketing, but it's easy enough to find this stuff if you're really interested.
Great. Well, I am very comfortable with marketing, and I would encourage everyone who's listening to get a chance to check out your larger body of work. Personally, I was very moved by Under Saturn's Shadow, and your new book is Living an Examined Life, which, coincidentally enough, a friend of mine who's deep into Jungian psychoanalysis, as he's been going to see an analyst, 2 days ago messages me and he goes, "Have you heard of this guy?" And he sent me a copy of your book. He's amazing. And I'm like, well, fancy that. In a couple days, I'm just about to interview him.
All that synchronicity. So it means something got constellated and both of you were participating in the same kind of energy field somehow.
Excellent. So for the listeners, links to everything will be contained for the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. Dr. Hollis, thank you for sharing your time with us today.
You're welcome, James. Good to be with you.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked it, please share it with a friend on social media or word of mouth. Just lean up and be like, hey, have you heard of Adventures Through the Mind? You should check it out. You should check it out. I mean, I do that pretty often, but I don't want to do it too much because it's my thing, so it kind of has less credibility somehow, it's almost like when your mom says that you're cool. But anyways, I appreciate your support in spreading the word of the show, as it is a smaller show and it is through word of mouth that it grows. Also, you can fully support the show by becoming a financial contributor to the developmental and sustainable cost of the project. You can do so by becoming my patron on Patreon or by leaving a one-time PayPal or crypto donation. Links to doing so are contained in the description to this episode and at jameswjesso.com. Also at jameswjesso.com, you can see the show notes for this episode, as well as all the other episodes, my written work, various videos that I do on YouTube, and just some other fun stuff. For example, I also mix bass music on the side, so you can find some of my bass music mixtapes kind of buried a little bit on the website, but you can check that out too. Everything is at jameswjesso.com, so thanks for heading over there and checking that out. That's it for now. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Bye.